Component props. Hey everybody, this is Ben Finkel, and in this nugget we're going to take a look at the component props or properties that you can use to associate dynamic values with your React.js components. It's the first step towards creating a truly dynamic reactive user interface. So like I've indicated before, I think that a React component is really the bread and butter of your React application. This little reusable chunk of code right here that we turn around and render down here in this bit of code is what makes React work. But as we've seen so far, it's not all that impressive. I mean, it's really just some HTML that's embedded inside of our JavaScript. So it's got all this extra JavaScript code around it, which has all the problems of HTML, plus it's obfuscated a little bit by all this confusing JavaScript that we may not understand right away. We haven't gotten anything interesting out of our React component. We haven't taken advantage of anything that JavaScript has to offer. What does JavaScript have to offer? Functionality. I often talk about the trifecta of web design, which is JavaScript, CSS, and HTML. HTML is your content, CSS is your presentation, and JavaScript is your functionality. So if we're going to move our code, our UI code into JavaScript, let's take advantage of JavaScript, and we're going to do that in React with props, state, and events. And right now, inside of this nugget, I want to talk specifically about props, which are properties. Properties are going to be the first bit of dynamic code inside of our UI that allows us to render customized versions of our component inside of our document. So props are really just a property bag. I don't think the official React documentation uses the phrase property bag anywhere, but it's one that I like to use because I think it really it gets across the idea of what props are. They're just a collection of values that are associated with a component. Typically they are a key value pair. So there's a key or a name of the value and then the actual value itself. And you're going to access it inside of this render function with something called this.props. I'll show you in a moment with some live demos how we can do that. The advantage to this is that we can have dynamic rendering of our data when we reuse our components. So if we want to render this component 3 or 4 or 5 times, each of those renderings, each of those instances can have different properties, different property values, and consequently they can look different. They can be a little bit different. Even though we've only defined our component a single time, we're rendering it differently each time. That's really important. Now another thing to know, this is really key to understand about properties, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but properties are immutable. They are set by, well, they're set by outside things, state changes, events, that sort of thing. We should never, inside of our component, write to this.props. Why should we never write to this.props? Well, this is what ultimately enables our unidirectional data flow design for rendering React components. One of the big reasons that React.js is so simple and easy and powerful to use is that when we write a component, we simply write it to render whatever is in the property values. We basically operate as if those are always up to date with exactly what we want them to be, and React handles what exactly gets rendered. You know, this little arrow here. So we're just creating a rendering definition. React renders that to the virtual DOM in memory, and then the virtual DOM performs its diff against the actual DOM and figures out what needs to change inside of the actual DOM. So we can write a very simple, easy function, component in this case, to render a UI component. And we know that React is going to handle all the dirty work about deciding what exactly to update inside of our actual HTML that's being rendered on the page. Now the easiest and fastest way to get properties into our component is to simply use HTML attributes inside of our JSX. So our JSX renders, you know, an open bracket and our thing, and then our close bracket. Well, we can say property equals value right here, and that is going to get stored inside of this.props for us. Take a look. Here I've got a very simple hello well, hello world component, and I'm rendering it on the screen. But check out what I've done here. I've said hello this.props.name. I have to get my my pen up on screen here. Sorry about that. So yeah, I've said hello and then curly braces this.props.name. So the curly braces, first of all, are a way to escape out of JSX and indicate that I actually want to reference JavaScript again. So I need some code in between those curly braces. The code that I want is this.props.name. But where did that come from? What is inside of this.props.name? It's just a variable inside of JavaScript. Well, it came from down here. You see in my JSX, down in my react-dom.render, I've said hello world, which is this guy right here. But then I've given it an attribute, name equals Benjamin. So when this renders, I can go ahead and click run. You see on the right hand side, hello Benjamin. If I change this and I make it Andrea, go ahead and click run. You can see that it's updated the name to read Andrea instead of Benjamin. So I can key in whatever value I want inside of my name property. And on top of that, I can actually render hello world multiple times if I want. So we can come over here and I'll say hello Andrea and also hello Sammy, and let's do a third one, why not, hello Alex. That works for me. Now a little trick of React is that when you have multiple components like this, you got to wrap it in some kind of containing element. I'm going to use div for that, but it could just be a span or anything else at all. So now when I go ahead and run this version of my code, I should get my three, oops, put my comma in the wrong spot there. That's always important to get your syntax correct. There's my three hello world elements rendered on the screen for me. Hello Andrea, Sammy, and Alex. So just by adding in this simple little property bag, this.props, I have a collection of dynamic properties that I can use when I render my element. And I'm not even stuck to simply fixed text here. Check this out. I've got a new component now in a new fiddle called itisNow, and I'm returning the current time is this.props.date.toTimeString. How do I get the date in there? Well, I could do it inside of the render function, but remember, I want to treat these as immutable. I want unidirectional code. I don't want my render function inside of my class to be updating those properties. Instead, what I do is down here in the property, I pass in a new date object, a new JavaScript date object into that property, and this render function here will get the exact date and time of when I run this. So I click run. It is 10:59:33. You can see over here on the right hand side. I can even do a cool little thing. This is straight from the React documentation, by the way. I love this. Is I can set an interval on this so that it runs repeatedly. And we will come down here and we'll simply say that we want this to run every 500 milliseconds, I believe that is. So now this react-dom.render is going to get executed over and over and over. I'm going to set this as the base, go ahead and click run, and what I should hopefully see happen is, yep, I'm seeing the time update, because every time this runs, it's re-rendering that time for me. So my render function simply spits out the time here, the current property value for the time. My property is filled in with the current date value, the current date time string, and then I use the set interval to actually update that. Now this is a very, very simple way to create a reactive component inside of React.js, an continually updating component. What I haven't done here yet is the next two key elements, and that's state and events. With state and events, we can add some real dynamic updatability to our components. So that concludes this nugget on component props for React.js. To recap, the props are a property bag, this.props, and it's a collection of key value pairs that you use inside of your component that are essentially carried around with that component and rendered on screen directly as is. They allow an entry point for dynamic values into your component so that every time you render that component on screen, you can actually pass in different values. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.